Before the blade descended on the neck of France's most despised queen, her enemies orchestrated one last act of cruelty, cold, deliberate, and meant to destroy more than her body. They didn't just want to kill her, they wanted to erase her from memory. Her journey from a golden throne to a rickety wooden cart, dragged through streets where her former subjects screamed for her blood, was meant to strip away every trace of the queen. But they failed. This is the story of what they did to Marie Antoinette in her final hours, and the shocking dignity she reclaimed amid total humiliation. Forget the glittering hall of mirrors at Versailles. Our story begins in the damp, rat-infested cell of the Conciergerie prison in Paris. This medieval fortress, grimly nicknamed the antechamber to the Guillotine, was the final stop for those condemned by the Revolution. On the night of August 2, 1793, after months locked away with her family, Marie Antoinette was torn from her children and sister-in-law and brought here, alone. For 76 days, the former Queen of France was no longer a monarch. She was simply prisoner number 280. Her cell was a narrow, foul-smelling box with dripping stone walls and a straw mattress. Privacy no longer existed. 2 guards stood inside her cell at all times, their eyes following her every movement. They watched her choke down thin prison soup. They watched her sleep fitfully. They even watched as she tried to change clothes behind a flimsy screen. This constant gaze was a weapon, dehumanizing her completely. For a woman who once commanded entire palaces, it was the ultimate insult. But the filth and cold were nothing compared to the psychological torture she endured. Just a month earlier, revolutionary guards had stormed into her room at the Temple prison in the dead of night. They had come for her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. Witnesses described a desperate mother throwing herself between the guards and her child, begging them not to take him. Her teenage daughter, Marie-Therese, clung to her brother, screaming. But the soldiers ripped the boy from her arms. She would never see him again. All that remained was a tiny portrait and a lock of his hair, hidden inside her corset. It wasn't the loss of her crown that broke her. It was the unbearable grief of a mother, her maid, Rosalie Lamorlière, who cared for her at the Conciergerie, would later recall that the only time the Queen truly wept was when she spoke of her children. By mid-October, the final act of her downfall began. On October 14, 1793, Marie Antoinette was dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal for what was little more than a political show trial. Unlike her husband, Louis XVI, who had weeks to prepare his defense, she was given less than a day. The charges were a chaotic blend of treason and twisted rumor, stories lifted straight from the scandalous pamphlets that had vilified her for years. They accused her of sending French funds to Austria, plotting massacres and even hosting sinful orgies at Versailles. But the last accusation was so vile, so clearly designed to destroy her soul, that even hardened revolutionaries fell silent. The prosecution, led by the zealous Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, accused her of committing incest with her own son. They had manipulated young Louis Charles, forcing him to sign a false confession against his mother. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen. Marie Antoinette said nothing. Then slowly she stood. She didn't look at her judges or the prosecutors. Instead, she turned toward the crowded gallery, toward the working-class women of Paris, many of whom had once shouted for her death. In a steady, unwavering voice, she declared, "I appeal to all mothers present in this room." The air shifted instantly. In that single defiant moment, she wasn't the hated Austrian woman or Madame Deficit. She was a mother defending her honor against an unspeakable lie. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Some of the same women who had called for her head now whispered in sympathy. For a brief instant, the power she once held returned, a flicker of her old grace, but it was fleeting. The verdict was never in question. In the early hours of October 16th, after a 2-day trial, an all-male jury found her guilty of high treason, the sentence death by guillotine. When asked if she had anything to say, she merely shook her head. What was there left to say? Back in her cell, she refused her final meal. "I need nothing now, my child," she told her maid softly. "Everything is over for me." Calmly, she took up a pen and wrote a final, heart-wrenching letter to her sister-in-law, pleading for forgiveness for her son, who had been coerced into betraying her. That letter was never delivered. It was intercepted and hidden away for years. When dawn rose over Paris, her final humiliation began. The guards ordered her to remove the black mourning dress she'd worn since her husband's execution, a symbol of her loss and her rank. In its place, they forced her into a thin, worn white gown, the garment of a penitent, not a queen. To change her clothing, she had to beg a guard to turn away for just a sliver of privacy. He refused. Then came the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson. One of his assistants grabbed a handful of her hair, once powdered, perfumed, and crowned with jewels, now dull and white from months of suffering. With a pair of rough scissors, he hacked it off. The act was both practical and symbolic. Cutting her hair ensured the guillotine's blade would fall cleanly, but it also stripped her of her last traces of womanhood and royal pride. Next, they tied her hands cruelly behind her back. "They did not bind my husband's hands," she protested, a flash of her old courage. The guards ignored her. The ropes were pulled tight enough to leave marks. Reduced to her most basic human needs, she even had to plead for permission to relieve herself in a corner before being taken away. At exactly 11 a.m., the gates of the conciergerie opened. Her husband, King Louis XVI, had been allowed a closed carriage for his final journey. She would not be granted that dignity. Waiting for her instead was a rough open wooden cart, the same kind used to haul common criminals. They forced her aboard, still bound, completely exposed to the eyes of the city. The ride to the Place de la Révolution lasted over an hour. The streets were packed, tens of thousands of people pressed together, shouting, spitting, jeering. The noise was deafening. The famous revolutionary artist, Jacques-Louis David, stood on a balcony sketching her as she passed, immortalizing her worn but defiant profile. The cart jolted violently over cobblestones, nearly throwing her off. Yet through it all, Marie Antoinette sat upright, her back straight, her face pale but steady. She neither wept nor bowed her head. She just stared forward, a solitary figure of composure in a storm of hate. When the cart finally rattled into the square, today known as the Place de la Concorde, the guillotine towered above the crowd, a grim silhouette against the grey October sky. The mob roared in anticipation of the bloody spectacle they had waited months to see. And yet, as she stepped down from the cart, something in the air shifted. Eyewitnesses later said she seemed calm, almost regal. Despite everything they had done to break her, she carried herself with quiet strength. She climbed the wooden steps of the scaffold alone, refusing the executioner's help. Then, in one final, haunting twist of fate, she accidentally stepped on Sanson's foot, the same man who had just cut her hair, tied her hands, and was moments away from ending her life. The crowd fell silent. Without hesitation, she looked at him and said softly, "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." It was a moment that stunned even her enemies. In that brief exchange, Marie Antoinette revealed the one thing the revolution could never destroy: her grace. That simple act of courtesy in the face of death became her last quiet rebellion. They could kill her body, but not her character. At precisely 12:15 p.m., the blade fell. The execution was swift. Sanson's assistant lifted her head by the white hair and held it high for the crowd. A thunderous cry erupted, "Vive la République!" Her body was tossed back into the same open cart and hauled to a nearby cemetery, where it was dumped into an unmarked mass grave. The revolutionaries believed they had erased her name, burying the last Queen of France like a common criminal. Yet her story refused to stay buried. According to legend, the wax artist Madame Tussaud was summoned to create a death mask from the Queen's severed head, a chilling tale that would follow her forever. More than 2 decades later, history turned one final page. In 1815, after the monarchy was restored, King Louis XIII ordered the exhumation of his brother and sister-in-law. Their remains were carefully identified and reburied, with royal honors in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the sacred resting place of French kings and queens. The revolution had aimed to destroy a symbol of royal excess. They stripped Marie Antoinette of her titles, her family, her dignity, and her life. But in those last moments, when she bowed her head not in fear but in courtesy, she proved that they could take her crown and her head, but never the shocking dignity that survived even the blade.